Even now, decades after its publication, American Gods remains one of the best takes on the idea of the egregore as a social force. I'm using egregore in the occult sense of a collective entity, a spirit, a demon, god, however you want to think of it, that has both an independent existence to some extent, but is also created and maintained by people believing in it. It's an idea that I think captures how our society works far better than any purely socioeconomic or psychological model. We respond to how we believe things are or how we believe they should be more strongly than to how they objectively are. Sometimes these are plainly stated. A codified belief system written down, laying down rules for how to conduct oneself. Islam, Christianity, Marxism. Things that purport to describe how the world is and how we should behave within it, with the underlying goal of perpetuating themselves. But others aren't so easily named. They're harder to pin down and so become more changeable with time. The meaning of stories changes. Heroes become villains, go from praised to disgraced, which is pointedly relevant in this case. This is not going to be a summary or a review of American Gods, nor is it a commentary on its author's transgressions, though I'll get back to Neil Gaiman later. For now, I'll just note that as a non-American, he both brings an insight that the native-born often can't see, but he also can't completely get the national character. Not like someone who grew up with cowboys and Indians, baseball, and 4th of July barbecues. Someone who has walked with the spirit of America since the earliest days. It's not a criticism, it's just the nature of life. The land and culture of our formative years has a profound impact on us. But the book. It begins with Shadow Moon. Yeah, that's his name, just roll with it. He's in prison, but he's due to be released in just a few more days, and he's eager to see his wife again as a free man. He's got a job lined up at the gym his best friend owns, set to turn his life around. But the warden wants a word. Shadow, we're going to be releasing you later this afternoon. You'll be getting out a couple of days early. The warden said this with no joy, as if he were intoning a death sentence. Shadow nodded, and he waited for the other shoe to drop. The warden looked down at the paper on his desk. This came from the Johnson Memorial Hospital in Eagle Point. Your wife, she died in the early hours of this morning. It was an automobile accident. I'm sorry. The best friend was driving, also dead. He crashed because she was going down on him at the time. And so Shadow re-enters a world that no longer has anything for him, betrayed and cut loose from any binding ties. And that's when he meets an older gentleman with an eye patch who introduces himself as Mr. Wednesday. Yeah, it's Odin. But not so much the All-Father of Norse myth as a con man. This is just one aspect of Odin, one peculiar to North America. To take a line from Odin Prime, I suppose, much later in the book. My people went from here to America a long time ago. They went there, and then they returned to Iceland. They said it was a good place for men, but a bad place for gods. And without their gods, they felt too alone. But that echo of their gods remained and changed. The new world is not the old, and it has different rules. There are many ways to think of it, and of course, the rational sociologist or historian would approach it in terms of the cultural impact of the frontier, of contact with the native tribes, all the things that made life in colonial North America different from well-established Europe, and how that led to cultural differences over time. But cultural perception is both more visceral and more nebulous. Knowing is downstream of feeling. We believe what we feel is right more than what we can objectively prove. The book frames it in terms of something in the land itself, as it is told to Shadow in a dream, in the earth and under the earth. This is not a land for gods, said the Buffalo Man. But it was not the Buffalo Man talking anymore, Shadow knew. In his dream, it was the fire speaking, the crackling and the burning of the flame itself that spoke to Shadow in the dark place under the earth. This land was brought up from the depths of the ocean by a diver, said the fire. It was spun from its own substance by a spider. It was shat by a raven. It is the body of a fallen father, whose bones are mountains, whose eyes are lakes. This is a land of dreams and fire, said the flame. That last is not a bad summation of this country's mythology. The land of opportunity, carved out with immense violence. Like every other culture, we have our taboos, our celebrations, feast days, rituals, and holy places, even if we don't really think of them that way. As they passed their first signpost to Mount Rushmore, still several hundred miles away, Wednesday grunted. "Now that," he said, "is a holy place." Shadow thought Wednesday was asleep. He said, "I know it used to be sacred to the Indians." "It's a holy place," said Wednesday. "That's the American way. They need to give people an excuse to come and worship. These days, people can't just go and see a mountain." Thus Mr. Gutzon Borglum's tremendous presidential faces. Once they were carved, permission was granted, and now the people drive out in their multitudes to see something in the flesh that they've already seen on 1,000 postcards. In terms of pilgrimages, America is full of such holy places. National parks, of which our acreage is greater than many countries, include all manner of such sites, from natural formations that draw people to them, battlefields, even some where the place itself is incidental. People visit the idea of the place. Millions of people have visited Thomas Edison's workshop, even though Henry Ford had it moved to Michigan. "So according to your theory," said Shadow, "Walt Disney World would be the holiest place in America." Wednesday frowned and stroked his beard. "Walt Disney bought some orange groves in the middle of Florida and built a tourist town on them. No magic there of any kind." But he can be forgiven for thinking that. This is a land of commercialization. Everything gets commodified and sold. Every pilgrimage to Rushmore or Gettysburg has a stop or two at McDonald's or Starbucks. Maybe they have their own gods too. Fat little Buddhas with cheeseburgers and lattes. But there's another piece I have to establish here before getting into my real point with this. The idea of the anti-sacred. I mean when a place is less sacred than any other place. Of negative sacredness. Places where they can build no temples. Places where people will not come and will leave as soon as they can. Places where gods only walk if they are forced to. "I don't know," said Shadow. "I don't think there's a word for it." "All of America has it a little," said Shonabog. "That is why we are not welcome here. But the center," said Shonabog. "The center is worst." In this case, he's speaking of one of several center-of-the-nation points. It floats around depending on what parameters are used for calculating it. In any case, it's just a point on a map. Nothing happened there. It doesn't mean anything. There's no magic, like a Starbucks or a megachurch. But this idea that beneath all the crass commercialization and grafted on old world belief systems that get warped and bent and commodified, there is something else. A real American essence, or rather several of them in layers, that exert a persistent influence whether or not one is aware of it. Bringing me to one of the prime egregores of America, a deified idea to some and an irredeemable villain to others, the white man. He strode across the land, sweeping aside the native peoples, enslaving, gorging on the forests and rivers, and generally being a bit of a dick while building cities like it was an Olympic event. There's a duality to this idea because to be the proper villain responsible for all the nation's sins, it has to be ascribed with immense power. To condemn the white man for all evils is to praise him for his great abilities. And this gets to something vital to American history, culture, and the fight over those things today. Coming from a white guy in the Black Hills, let that color what I'm about to say according to your own personal pantheon of minor gods. While I wasn't there personally, my people, the white men, took this land from the Lakota, who took it from the Cheyenne, who pushed out the Kiowa. I bring this up not as justification, defense, gloating, or absolution, but as a reminder that this continent was fought over. The white man fought for centuries to conquer it, and the red man for centuries before that. Some just had a spark of righteous disapproval over my terminology, instead preferring that I say Native American, First Nations, or some other sanitized vagary before reminding us all of very real massacres, forced relocations, and broken treaties. Because a lot of people want to frame the native tribes as victims. They aren't. Throughout all of American history, from the first settlers to today, the white man has seen the red man as both a powerful ally and a fearsome enemy. Atrocities were committed in both directions, and there was bitter hatred in many cases. But as a culture, America has a deep martial respect for the proud warrior, both friend and foe. Why do so many of our military units incorporate their imagery into their patches and banners? We fly into battle on machines with names like Apache, Chinook, and Blackhawk. Monuments are built, images appear on our currency, tribal place names endure. Some call it cultural appropriation, and they lean into the egregore of the victim, pure in their helplessness and suffering. Because they can't see it as anything else. They don't understand that it's a sign of profound respect, just as they can't see Confederate monuments as anything other than endorsements of slavery, because they don't understand valor, either as a virtue in themselves or in their enemies. But those are old stories, old god things. The story of American gods is built on the conflict between the old gods and the new. Media, technology, even gods of various levels of government and society. Mr. Town, Mr. World, the spooks, two men in dark suits with dark hair and shiny black shoes. Spooks. One was square-jawed, wide-shouldered, great hair, looked like he had played football in high school. The nebulous they. Because while we know that government is just a bunch of people in buildings shuffling paper around, interactions with it can be like dealing with some alien thing whose motives can't be comprehended. An eldritch horror that can inconvenience you, deprive you of livelihood, freedom, or life if you draw its ire. For some, it's a monster that must be restrained, even slain. Others treat it like a loving father god or a genie granting wishes. Bring me free stuff and smite my enemies. The big political disputes are almost always about stories. Egregore god things more than specific policies. It's all imaginary anyway. That's why it's important. People only fight over imaginary things. And ours is a nation born in conflict. Go walking down the street of any large American city and you probably won't get the impression of a warrior culture. But it's there in street names, little memorials buried under the advertising and obesity. We go to war with our problems, drugs, poverty, crime, trying to slay the idea of the thing in battle. And our politics reflects that, in cycles. Intense violence takes a generation or two to fully charge up, but we're seeing some of it now. If we go full-on civil war, I may just throw a spear off the top of this mountain and dedicate the whole bloody affair to Odin, or Ares, or the Constitution, whatever god seems most appropriate on that particular day. But I did say I would get back to the author, didn't I? Neil Gaiman has written several works that play with this idea of myth and story as active forces, whether the various gods in this book or the archetypes of the Sandman series. There's an exploration of how these things shape the world that can offer a lot of insight. But as sometimes is the case, great artists turn out to not be very good people. I'll not get into the details, but the public perception of the author has changed drastically in the last couple of years, and that naturally changes the perception of his work. You can never completely separate the work and the author, though I generally encourage people to try and judge the work on its own merits. But it gets into the question of what a story really means. Is it what the author intended to say? Or what that author says they meant years or decades later, which can often be very different things? Or what the wider culture makes of it? If millions of people read a book or watch a film, and they get a message from it that they internalize and make part of their collective story, and then the author says, no, you've got it all wrong, it's about X, not Y. Well, writers don't have editorial control over what the culture does with their creations. Ask the creator of Pepe the Frog about that. Once it's out in the world, a story's meaning is determined in a marketplace of ideas. Not everyone would use a commerce metaphor, but this is a land for it. It's a fight raging today with nearly every piece of media getting judged against political alignments. Is it too woke, or not woke enough, or so woke it's parody and becomes based? I talked a little about this in my recent video on The Matrix, which drew a lot of comments about how the Wachowskis said it was about gender transitioning and therefore that settles it. Checkmate red pill righties. Only what they said is much more nuanced. I won't quote the entire exchange here, but link in the description. In short, it wasn't a conscious allegory, though it did percolate into the story in less direct ways. And that's why it endures instead of being a niche film firmly on one side of the culture war. It's a story about change, about defining your own identity, about escaping a cage of lies, even though it won't necessarily make you happier to get out. People can relate it to their own lives and experience because those are universal things, not just a specific story for specific people. Star Wars is another one, though in different ways. George Lucas didn't say that the rebels were the Viet Cong, but that there are parallels, and with the American Revolution and many other underdogs fighting huge empires, which means the empire isn't a one-for-one stand-in for the United States, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, the British Empire, or anything else. But it's influenced by all of those things. It distills some essence of hegemonic powers and resistance to them through a story that can be used to grasp at the deeper workings beneath specific wars and regimes. A story that helps us understand our world specifically because it isn't about our world. And American Gods, in yet another way, is that kind of story. And in this case, it aligns with what the author was grappling with, at least so he said 10 years later. America, this strange, huge place where I now found myself living that I knew I didn't understand. But I wanted to understand it. More than that, I wanted to describe it. Is this effort to understand and describe America, written in the 90s, relevant today? A lot has changed, but perhaps not so much on a fundamental mythic level. It still speaks to some essential nature, how people come here from other places and leave bits of their old lives buried in the churning superculture of America. The book depicts all those old gods that came with successive waves of immigrants, mostly forgotten and existing on the edges of some shadow of what they once were, as the people that brought them gradually became Americans. But even gods that aren't forgotten are changed by this place. We see it all around us. Christianity in America can be a quite different beast from its European brothers. This is the land of the megachurch and the televangelist, commodifying salvation with stage lights and an opening musical act. Which makes me wonder about the current wave of immigration, which is in some ways very different from previous eras. Most of the concern about specifically Muslim immigration into this country is in the form of opposition to it. And I suspect that in a generation or two, it will have a significant effect. But it won't be one way. I suspect that the old Islamic world will end up being aghast at what their faith mutates into here. Gods can survive in America, but this place irrevocably changes them. And what happens in America very rarely stays in Inshallah.